Hey there. Ready to unlock some Agile expertise?
Mm.
Today we're doing a deep dive into the heart of it all. User stories. You know those sticky notes you see on project boards? Turns out they're not just reminders. They're more like mini blueprints for success.
That's right. User stories might seem simple, but they can really change how a team works together, how they communicate, and in the end, how well they build something truly valuable.
Okay, so let's break this down. For anyone who's new to this, imagine planning a road trip, right? You wouldn't just say, let's drive across the country. You'd break it down, map out the legs of the journey, figure out where to stop, what to see along the way. User stories are kind of like that roadmap, but for projects.
Exactly. They take a big goal, which could feel overwhelming, and break it down into smaller, manageable pieces. Each user story represents a small piece of functionality, and each of those pieces delivers value to, you guessed it, the user.
And that's the key, right? Because it's so easy to get lost in the weeds of a project. Like, remember that example we saw about the restaurant menu? The one where it wasn't clear if soup or salad meant you could get both or if you had to choose.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
User stories can really help avoid those kinds of misunderstandings when you're working on a project.
It's all about clarity. A well-written user story follows a specific format. Usually, as a type of user, I want goal so that there's like a starting point for a conversation, getting the team to really think about who they're building this for and why.
So it's more than just writing things down. It's about having those important conversations because of what's written down.
Precisely. And those conversations can be a game changer, especially if you compare it to the old way of doing things.
Yeah.
You know, those massive requirements documents that no one really enjoyed reading, let alone actually using to build something.
Oh, tell me about it. And that actually reminds me of the analogy we found about wedding registries.
Oh, yes. I see what you mean.
Getting so caught up in adding everything you can think of to the list without even thinking about, well, the cost.
Exactly. Just like a well-planned registry that leads to a happier bank balance, a project that uses well-defined user stories from the start helps manage the scope, keep things on schedule, and stay on budget. No surprises, no budget blowouts.
And way fewer headaches for everyone involved, right? But speaking of well-defined, how do we make sure these user stories are actually effective? What makes a good user story in the first place?
Well, that's where the details really come into play. And that's where things get interesting. There's a handy acronym, I-INVEST, that we can use to evaluate our user stories.
Invest. Okay, that sounds kind of like, I don't know, a financial strategy. Is that what we're talking about here? Agile ROI and all that?
Not exactly, although a well-crafted user story can definitely lead to a healthier project, bottom line, so to speak. But each letter in I-INVEST stands for a characteristic of a good, solid user story. Independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable.
Okay, I'm going to need you to break that down a little bit more for me, starting with independent. What does that even mean when we're talking about a user story?
Good question. So independent means that a user story, ideally, should be able to stand on its own. It shouldn't have to depend on another story being completed before you can get to it. Think back to our road trip analogy. Each leg of the journey, while it's part of a bigger trip overall, still has a defined starting point and an ending point.
Right.
And that makes it easier to plan, to manage, and even to rearrange things if you need to.
So instead of a user story that's like, as a driver, I want to reach Los Angeles, which depends on, well, the entire journey, you would say, as a driver, I want to drive from Chicago to Denver, which is a self-contained part of that whole journey.
Exactly. Now, this isn't to say that user stories can't be related at all, but aiming for independence like that helps with prioritizing, and it gives you flexibility as you're going through the development process.
Got it. Okay, what about negotiable? Now, that one seems a little counterintuitive to me, right? Because we want clear goals, we don't want something that's wishy-washy.
Absolutely. But when we say negotiable in this context, what we're really referring to are the details, not the core value. So the user need, that I want to track my order, is definitely essential, but how you get there, for example, it must have a real-time map. Those details can be discussed. They can be potentially refined based on things like feasibility or any technical limitations there might be, even budget constraints. Remember, Agile is all about adapting and finding the best possible solution by working together.
So finding that balance between having a clear vision and being open to making adjustments along the way.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, valuable seems pretty straightforward, but I have a feeling it's probably more than meets the eye, right?
You got it. This is where we circle back to the "so that" in our user story template. A valuable user story clearly states the benefit or the outcome for the user. Remember that example from our research about the job posting website?
The one where it said, like, as a job seeker, I want to upload my resume, and it wasn't specific enough.
Right. It was just kind of vague.
Hmm.
But by adding so that potential employers can easily find and consider my qualifications, we took that vague action, just upload my resume, and turned it into a valuable outcome. Employers can find those qualifications. It's all about focusing on the why behind the what.
And suddenly, it's not just uploading a file. It's about making connections, opening up opportunities for people.
I like it.
Okay, now, estimable and small, those seem pretty interconnected. What's the key takeaway there?
You're right. Those two really do tend to go together. Estimable basically means that the user story has to be clear enough that the development team can look at it and estimate how much effort it's going to take to actually build it. And that's where small comes in. Because if a user story is too broad or too complex, it's going to be very difficult to estimate how much work it's going to be.
It's like trying to figure out how much it's going to cost to build a house if all you've got is build a house versus having, like, actual blueprints.
Precisely. Breaking down those bigger goals, which are often called epics, into smaller user stories, ones that are much more manageable, is super important. It's like that lawnmower example from our research.
Yep.
I want to mow my lawn faster is a starting point, sure, but we need to know more. How much faster? What kind of lawn are we even talking about here? The more specific and the smaller you can make that user story, the easier it will be to estimate.
Makes sense. And that brings us to testable. So I'm assuming this is all about making sure that user story can actually be proven, right?
Exactly. A testable user story includes those very specific criteria that tell you when it's actually done, when it's been achieved. And these are often called conditions of satisfaction or sometimes acceptance criteria.
Okay, can you give me a more concrete example of that? Okay, so for our testable example, let's stick with that online order tracking system we were talking about. What would a condition of satisfaction look like for something like that?
All right, so let's say our user story is, as a customer, I want to be able to track my order online so that I know when my delivery is going to arrive. We could say a condition of satisfaction for that would be something like, the system has to show the package's real-time location on a map, and it also has to give an estimated delivery date that's accurate, let's say, within a 2-hour window. So that gives our developers a very clear target that they need to hit.
So it's like saying, okay, I will know for sure that this feature's done. It's complete when it can do this very specific thing.
Exactly.
No more ambiguity. I'm really starting to see how all of these different invest elements come together to create a really tight, really effective user story.
Exactly. And you know what's really cool about this? You don't have to be a software developer to benefit from using this approach.
That's right. And we've been talking a lot about software development here, but one of the things that really stood out in our research was how adaptable these user stories can be. We saw examples for things like marketing campaigns, even product design, and even like personal goals.
That's right. You can use them for so many things. Like if you were planning a marketing campaign, you could have a user story like, as a marketing manager, I want to launch a social media campaign so that we can increase brand awareness and reach new customers. Or, even in your personal life, like if you're working on a personal goal, as a writer, I want to make sure I'm writing at least 500 words every single day so that I can finish my novel by the end of the year.
So it's really about no matter what you're working on, if you can figure out who this is for, what you're trying to achieve, and why, then you can actually use a user story to bring a lot more clarity and focus to that goal.
Exactly.
I love that. This has been a really eye-opening deep dive for me, I've got to say. We really covered a lot of ground, from the basics of what is a user story to some pretty in-depth strategies for actually writing user stories that are really going to be effective.
We really did. But it's important to remember, even if you just grasp that core concept of what a user story is, that focus on delivering value to whoever that end user is, breaking down those big goals, and making sure everyone is communicating clearly, that in itself can make a huge difference in how you tackle projects and collaborate with the people around you.
Absolutely. And for any listening who's ready to really go deeper with this, don't forget to check out the User Story mini course that we mentioned earlier. It's a fantastic resource to really level up your Agile game. But for now, we're going to leave you with this thought. How could you use the power of user stories to make your own work or even your personal life a little bit smoother, a little bit more organized, and a lot more focused on what really matters to you? Something to think about. Until next time, happy collaborating.